Good evening. This is the Finance and Properties May 31st meeting for the departmental review of budgets for the City Council, reviewing the mayor's budget. This evening, we will be reviewing some department heads, Pauline Textera, who's here, David Delano, Brian Ailes. We also have our budget analyst, Jerry Perry, who will speak first. And without further ado, I think we can jump straight into the budget. And I'll ask Mr. Perry if he would say a few words.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the City Council. Pleasure to be here this evening. I'm going to spend the next 4 or 5 minutes just giving you a quick overview as I see the FY23 budget proposal is requested by Mayor Cahill. I forwarded to you all my summary memorandum yesterday morning, so hopefully you all got it. And my executive summary details most of my commentary here, but also I broke down some of the departments and gave you some information in terms of things like variances and things of that nature. Probably the most important thing that I do on your behalf as city councilors, and was what initiated back 25, 30 years ago when the city got itself financial trouble, was it's my role to determine whether I believe the mayor and the finance director are forwarding to you what is determined to be a balanced budget. You know, do the revenues match expenditures? And as I am going to report to you tonight that in my professional opinion, based upon my review of the submission of the mayor, that this is in fact a balanced budget. And if you were to pass it as is over the next month here, that the Department of Revenue would certify the tax rate, they would determine it to be balanced as well. The mayor is contemplating raising $150,582,000 in the general fund. And the total budget, which when you incorporate all the enterprise funds and things of that nature, amounts to $213,565. So we're just creeped over for the first time in the history of the city, $170 million when you incorporate enterprise funds on top of the general fund. Now, with regard to the general fund is contemplated to be increased by $6.4 million. That equates to 4.43% increase in the general fund this year. I have reviewed the calculations that the finance director has done with regard to Proposition 2.5. It's my opinion he has done that properly. He's doing 2.5% increase. I remind you that there still is $1.1 million in what is known as excess levy capacity that's still on the table, that the city could raise in future date there. They did not go up that amount. They could by law, but they only went up 2.5% of the levy. The mayor has contemplated new growth at $1,050,000. I'm okay with that based upon historical reviews and looking at past precedent. I think it's a good number. This is entirely possible it may come in higher at that when the new growth is approved by the Revenue Department this fall, but I think the $1,050,000 is a good number. You should be comfortable with it as well. One of the areas I did spend a little additional time this year in my review was the estimated receipts and other revenues that come up to the $150 million in the general fund. What the finance director is contemplating is bringing back what I call local receipts, meals, rooms, things of that nature, up to pre-pandemic levels. He has done that, in my view, yet he's been conservative enough, again, to be consistent with the way he did it prior to the COVID. And I'm comfortable in general with the numbers. I think it's a little over $11 million that he is contemplating putting before you, and I support that as well. With regard to, on top of the general fund, and specifically as it relates to transfers, you'll see some transfers. $600,000 is going to be transferred from water retained earnings. We're also going to have a conversation, I believe, next Monday about some transfers. I think it's $200,000 from water transfer for another matter to deal with the deficit. But we'll discuss that a little bit more next Monday night. But I'm a little concerned about that. I've discussed this with the finance director. We can afford it. I am encouraged, based on my review and my discussions with the finance director, that the money's coming in at the last quarter of the fiscal year and retained in the water rates are pretty robust, and I think we'll be okay, but it's something I will be monitoring as well. The SER contemplates $808,000 coming from retained earnings, recreation $80,000, senior citizens $41,398. There is all sufficient funds in all of the balance sheets to cover these, and I'm comfortable if you decide to approve those transfers, which we would do through the process. I'm okay with that. With regard to the water and sewer rates, the water rate is going to go from $3.17 per cubic feet to $3.28. As I indicated, the water transfer of $600,000 is going to occur. Last year, we transferred $900,000, so we're doing a little bit less, and that's, I think, where we were able to keep it. We had to go up a little bit, at least to make sure that it's balanced in nature. The sewer rate remains the same, $6.24 per cubic feet, so we have a combined water sewer rate of $9.52. It's my view, if you pass that rate at $9.52, that you will have balanced budgets within the enterprise funds, and all revenues, in my view, match expenditures with regard to, I think it's 7 enterprise funds we have there. With regard to expenditures, obviously the biggest one is the school department. I'm sure you've already seen that. I wrote to you in my executive summary. The schools are contemplating a 6.1% increase in expenditures for this year. It amounts to $3,967,000, $527. The schools contemplate 21.1 new FTEs to be added to the system. I think it's 13 would be for the general fund. I think 2 a circuit breaker, and 6.1, I believe, are from grants. So there is an increase in FTEs. On the municipal side, the mayor is proposing an additional 4.5 new FTEs to the municipal side. 3 of them will be patrol officers in the police department. 1 is the assistant finance director, which you have already approved at a previous meeting. And then finally, there's going to be a part-time Council of Aging outreach individual that the mayor is proposing forwarding to you. On top of all that, on the municipal side at least, as I wrote to you, they are contemplating, or they're asking for another $700,000 to roads and sidewalks this year from the prior fiscal year. That will equate to $2.7 million from the Appropriations General Fund from the city's levy. If you add in Chapter 90 funds and some other funds, it's just going to go a little bit north of $4 million a year, which will be the most in the history of the city of Beverly, based on my experience, that has been appropriated and raised for roads and sidewalks, something that I know all of you have brought to my attention, and certainly from your constituents you've heard as well. You'll see a decrease in debt of $2.2 million this year. It's consistent with capital expenditure report, and we were able to do some things, specifically, I think, with roads and sidewalks, so you're going to probably see that debt go back up again. We're going to have the City Hall project and a few others consistent with our capital and expenditure report, and as such, we were able to, I think the mayor was able to give a little bit more than he normally would on roads and sidewalks as a direct result of the decrease in debt. So we're all set with that, and that's there. You've already heard from the mayor, and I think the finance director, we need $171,000. The Department of Revenue requires every 5 years a deeper dive on the valuations. They kind of go to each and every house, and we need to do this over 2 years. So that's kind of something that happens once every 5 years. We need to do that. Healthcare went up 3%. The vocational education went up $400,000. Sanitation's up $199,000. And pensions, which is something we always keep an eye on, is going up $612,000. It's a combination of making sure we have the fully funded by 2033, and then, as you recall, we slightly increased the cost of living formula for the pensioners, so that's why we're seeing the 612 increase. As you know, and I know we have some new councilors, but I say this every year anyways, you have every right to pass this budget if you so desire to do so. You have every right to reduce any line item you so desire, with the exception of, in the school department, you can't go below net school spending. But that would require you to cut about $12 million. I don't think that's going to happen, so I'm not too worried about it, but that's one of the restrictions you have. But beyond that, you can't transfer from one line item to the other. And you certainly can't raise any line item. You can ask of the mayor if he's kind enough to do that, but the bottom line to it, all you can basically do is reduce a line item if, in your opinion, that meets your policy positions. I do want to talk briefly, and I'm almost completed here, Mr. Chairman, with regard to the tax rate that you're going to pass in November or December this year. As I've talked to some of you one-on-one or some of our group meetings with the mayor, we are going to go up 2.5%. At least that's was being contemplated unless you cut budgets. We are at the maximum shift of 175, so we don't have any capacity to give relief to the residential homeowners beyond what we've already done. We're kind of at the wall of that. So when we go up 2.5%, that means that the city's going to raise approximately $2.9 million off the levy above and beyond what we're doing the current fiscal year. And I know Councilor Feldman, and I sent her some information with regard to tax classifications. We discussed this a little bit at one of our meetings, but the bottom line to it is what we're seeing is, from my analysis, a 16.7% increase in residential values in the greater Boston area. And as a result of that increase of residential values, my concern as budget analyst, and I have to say this publicly so everyone's on the same page, it could make that residential class grow. As a matter of fact, it will make that residential class grow. When the assessors do the evaluations, it says the values of last January 1st, 2022. So it's already in the books, and they're doing their data reviews, and it'll be submitted to the state in the fall, and we'll know the final numbers. But if that class grows, and you're also going up 2.5%, raising $2.9 million, what's going to happen is going to give a disproportionate share of the overall levy of the 100%, which involves open space, commercial, industrial, recreation, open space, commercial, industrial classifications. And as such, what's going to happen is, even though you may be going up 2.5% on the levy, you need to be prepared as a city council that the average residential tax bill, given the huge increase in values, could go up anywhere 3 to 7%. And that's just, I don't know, nobody knows that until the assessors finish their jobs and look at the values and get them approved by the state. I think one of the councilors asked me the question, which is a good one. If you didn't even go up to the 2.5%, you had no increase whatsoever in the levy, and you eliminated $2.9 million, you're still going to see an increase in residential tax bills because the values are going to increase, and as such, they're going to get a bigger hit in terms of the tax rate when the time comes. So it's important that you be aware of the fact, and the way the process is the taxes will be, the values will be reviewed, they'll be approved in the fall, and your constituents will not see this until they get their January 1st bill. So that's kind of how it will shake out when the time comes. Having said all that, Mr. Chairman, in closing, I want to take the opportunity to thank the mayor, our finance director, and his entire staff. The school officials, they were great to me this year. They actually spent a couple hours of their time, the school superintendent and the business manager. I want to publicly thank them for that, to go over some of the budget issues there. All the city staff, the department heads, and obviously the 9 of you, the city councils, have been good to me, who call me in the middle of my dinner time, Mr. Chairman, and ask me all kinds of questions, but it's always a pleasure to do that. I enjoy my job. I think it's a wonderful experience, and I want to publicly thank all of you for the opportunity to serve you. In closing, I will be here for all your hearings. I will hopefully answer any questions. I can be of assistance in your deliberations. And Mr. Chairman, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you or your colleagues may have, either now or going forward with the budget presentation. And that concludes my commentary, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perry. Members of Finance and Property, have any questions for Mr. Perry?
Just had a comment. Just want to thank you, Mr. Perry. You prepare very thorough memos to us and send them to us all the time, and I feel like I am better prepared as a counselor due to your efforts, so thank you. And
Thank you.
I'm sure throughout this ordeal we'll reference your wisdom as we go, so thank you.
Thank you, Council.
Madam President? No comments?
No, thank you.
Other councilors, any questions for Mr. Perry? Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. So I will add my thanks as well for the memo and the work that went into it. And was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the tax rate setting process. Sure. Because one of the conversations that I heard in the financial forecasting committee, and then was sort of keeping in mind in starting to review the budget, was, looking at revenues overall. And for very good reasons, we put in conservative estimates of all the other types of revenues. But for setting the tax rate, we're looking at sort of what can we maximize. And so I'm just curious if we find, for example, that other revenues are coming in very strongly, the beginning of the fiscal year. Is there any point after we pass this budget when we could shift the balance of revenues and say, actually, we don't need as much property tax revenue because everything else came in above what was budgeted?
Sure.
Or is this our last point?
That's a great question, and it actually happened last year, just before you came. You're absolutely correct in your assessment. When the mayor and the assessors looked at the tax rate last year, and given the large increase of the residential values, which is very much on my mind, what they ended up doing last year is they tapped a little bit more of the new growth that was certified. They didn't know until it got certified, and they, as I recall, reduced a little bit of the overlay, as I recall. If I'm wrong, Mr. Ailes will correct me. So the combination of those two things was which allowed for them not to go up to 2.5%, and they left the 1.1 million. So the answer to your question is yes, it is possible. A lot of people don't realize this. The assessors are an incredibly influential entity with regard to the budget. They're the ones who set the rate, really. It's not the mayor, it's not the finance director, it's the assessors by law. And they will come in. Now, they obviously work with the finance director and the mayor, but is it possible that that could happen? The answer is yes. Whether it will or not, who knows? Let's see what happens when we're having a Thanksgiving dinner, and we'll have a sense of things more so hopefully at that period of time. But the answer is yes, it could occur.
Right, thank you. That's it, thanks.
Just to follow up on that, that would create another excess levy capacity
Yes.
factor, right?
It could occur, that's right. If, let's just say, I'm just making this up hypothetically, the new growth doubles to 2 million. I don't think that's going to happen, but I'm just trying to throw that as an example. The mayor may say, the mayor with, concurrence of the finance director may say, well, because we have so much new growth, maybe we can give a little bit more relief back to our homeowners, mostly on the residential side. But keep in mind, that also filters into commercial and industrial and everything else. But yes, if they were to do that, it would, and again, to refresh your memories, the mayor could have requested the entire 2.9 plus 1, it would have been $4 million approximately to go up in the levy. He chose not to, he and the finance director chose not to do that this fiscal year, but in a future year, they could claw that back if they want. That's their choice, and then you would have to either agree or disagree based on the budget appropriations. But yeah. It would, you're right, Mr. Chairman, it would increase the excess levy capacity.
Thank you. I just have, I'm sorry, did you have go ahead.
I did, I just thought of it.
Yes, please, go ahead.
In terms of the general fund revenues and the forecasting, I'm yet to see, and I don't feel like the increase for FY23 could include this, the revenue, the tax revenue that will be generated by cannabis retail. When are we going to start seeing that? Because I know they're
I don't know maybe
to
the
open.
finance director, can you help me with that? We don't have any open. Oh, nothing's open in the city yet. So if nothing's open, you're not going to see it in FY23. The DOR will not allow it until you get 1 year under your belt, so to speak.
1 year,
Yeah.
okay. So from opening, it's 1 year then?
Pretty much, yeah. From my experience, yes.
Okay. I just know we have at least two, one,
Yo, by all means, I'm not super familiar about the status of the cannabis stores, so.
there are, a lot of the permits are in Ward 5, so I know.
Mr. Perry was correct. With the Division of Local Services, they don't allow us to forecast any revenue until they get kind of the lay of the land, and then they'll allow us, based on what we bring in for our first year, to incorporate that and to count on that in the budget process.
Okay.
Hope that helps.
That does, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Perry, I do have one request of you, if you would, as we discussed just before your dinner this evening. The columns in the budget, the 2021 actual, the 2022 original budget, revised budget, actual budget, projected, and then the mayor's recommendation, especially for the newer counselors. If you could just go through the conversation that you and I had about the relative significance of those and what would be most helpful from your point of view, for the counselors to sort of focus on as being relevant and significant.
Sure.
And not.
Understood. And the finance director certainly can jump in incorrectly say something. So we run what is known as the Munis software package. I'm sure you've all heard of that there. And that's pretty much what you have in front of you. These are Munis printouts here. I just happen to open page 18 to answer the chairman's question, but if you look on any page, pretty much, if you want to go to 18 with me, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, when this is printed by our city auditor, it was printed on May 20th, 2022 at 12:57 p.m. So that's when this is all done here. But to answer the questions, when you go across it's almost like a mini spreadsheet, if you will, the 2021 are the actual appropriations, I'm sorry, the actual money spent in fiscal year 21. So that's that column. The second column is the 2022 original budget. Those are the columns that the city council voted on a year ago. So that's what those numbers are in terms of the second column. The 2022 revised budget, that's when things start shifting around, transfers come in, money goes out, things are moved around, things of that nature. So that's a moving target sometimes, and they have things like encumbrances are sometimes placed in that as well, at least from my experience. The 2022 actual, as I understand it, and I'm sure Brian can correct me, that's why I went back to that 5/20/22 at 12:57. That's what is in Munis at that date and time. That's what they've spent, that's what they have.
As of May 20th.
As of May 20th at 12:57 p.m., yes. That's what has actually been spent. Oh, I won't say spent. That's what's actually been recorded in the system by the finance officials of the city. So they get, they get vouchers and payments, and they pay them, and they fill in the system that has been paid, and that's what has been posted in the Munis system at that point in time. The 2022 is the projection. That's what they think they're going to spend. It varies. It never hits it, but that's what, it keeps an eye on things. So the finance director, if he's concerned about, overspending a line item, that kind of helps him a little bit with that. And then finally, the 2023 mayor's recommendation, that's what's before you now. That's what you have. When I wrote my memo to all of you there over the weekend, I compared the second column, the 2022 original budget, what you appropriated, your role a year ago, versus what you're was being asked of you. I compared it to that second to last column, the mayor's recommended budget of 2023. So that's that. The only thing, the percentage change, it's my understanding that percentage change is the mayor's recommendation versus the revised budget. It kind of confuses me sometimes, quite frankly, but a lot of times I just look at what was originally budgeted versus what is being requested of the mayor. So that's my interpretation. If I made a mistake, the finance director has concurred with me on this. It's nice that he's agreeing with me, and it makes me happy. But that's pretty much how these columns work in your budget booklets.
Thank you very much. So just to clarify, I know that in previous years, I focused a lot on the percentage change as being a significant number to focus on, and as our conversation went along, you were saying really not so much. It's really to have an apples-to-apples comparison. It is the original budget 2022 and the mayor's recommended budget numbers that gives you an apples-to-apples comparison.
Right.
The others are not so relevant.
Well, the only thing I'd say on the revised,
percentage
I wouldn't say it's not relevant. I mean, things happen during the year that requires more funding to be dumped on a line item. So at least on the revised gives you some sense of what the real world is going about. So, but the Munis system does do the percentages based on the revised. I just happen to look at your roles. All 9 of you have a role to appropriate money. That's why I looked at the second column and the mayor's recommendation. That's the functionality of the city council and your roles, and that's the one I focused on. But I wouldn't ignore it, but it gives you some sense. I also put in my memorandum to you, I tried really hard to give variances, to give you a sense of they're going up or down. Most of them are pretty innocuous in nature, but if you look at my memo, hopefully you have it with you tonight, it gives you some sense of how much they're going up. I took the time to calculate that as well.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Mr. Perry? Thank you very much, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish you the best, and I will be here till the end. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dextero, if you'd like to take a few minutes to talk about your department, your budget, before we turn it over to the councilors for any questions they might have.
Sure. Do you want me to point out the lines that have increased this year?
Yes.
Okay. The first one that's increased.
Oh, I'm sorry. For councilors, it's page 38.
Oh.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the first line that's increased is the overtime line, and that is overtime for the employees in my department, the HR administrator, Jen Smith, and HR assistant, Mary Sullivan. We increased the line by $700. We found that we've had a need for overtime within the department in the past year, and we anticipate having that need again. Not a lot, but just want to have something there in case we need it. It's mostly for projects that may have a deadline or projects work outside the regular workday. The next line with an increase is part-time. So this is part-time staff if we have someone come in to help us with a specific project. And this would be, we used to have we had, some of you may know Pat Parsons, who used to be the HR administrator for many years. She retired. And when she retired, we budgeted $5,000 for her to come in and do special projects for us as a retiree. When it got to the point where she didn't want to do the special projects anymore, we reduced this line. But we have used it this year, and we do anticipate that we may need it again. And so, again, I'd like to have something there. These are for example, a special project may be something like, recently we had to recalculate premiums for our survivor benefits, and it was a big project. It took a long time, and we had someone help us with that. And thankfully, we had the money there to do it. And the other increase is in employee physicals. And this is mostly for pre-employment physicals, but we also do our employee DOT recertifications, our drug screens. We've had an increase in our employee physicals and recertifications. And we are hiring more employees, so we know that we're going to have more physicals.
All right, thank you very much. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Councilor St. Hilaire.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kashera, for the overview. I guess, so my day job overseeing HR department, and I know it's been a challenging time for the last couple of years. I had just a couple questions for you. COVID impacts, I guess, I don't see anything in here related to that at all. Is that handled separately through another budget line item somewhere else in the budget? So that was the first question, and then number two was, I know in my conversations with Mr. Toppin that there were a number of DEI-related HR initiatives. Is there funding in here to support those? What is the status of those initiatives?
Well, I can speak to the DEI initiatives. Last year, we increased our advertising line by, the year before it was $1,800. We increased it to $5,000 because we post our jobs in many diverse job boards now. We used to post in just the typical city website, Mass Municipal Association. Now we post diversity.com, workplace.com, workplacediversity.com, blackjobs.com, many different locations. And some of them cost money, some of them don't. Most of them do cost money. But we've already increased that line, so we are addressing that.
Okay, so the advertising line item, would that represent the totality of our HR DEI budget?
Sure.
There is also, when we get to the executive section, there is a bucket of money for specifically DEI initiatives. Contained within that is some specific training, employment type training, as well as other initiatives. So Ms. Texera and Mr. Toppin were collaborating on a lot of that. It's just a matter of where the money's sitting.
Yeah, that's just what I was curious about. Okay. In any similar with COVID expenses, or?
Not within this department, not within this budget.
Okay, thank you.
Madam President, any questions?
No, thank you. Councilor St. Hilaire asked the question I was guessing at, which I was curious to know if the advertising increased from the previous year, and I also wondered about HR publications, job fairs, seminars, and memberships. Were both related to DEI initiatives and hiring, and so you had touched on that. So thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question regarding longevity, and I noticed not just in your department, but in others as well, there's a line for longevity payments for what I would assume are non-union employees such as yourself. I'm curious if there's a city policy that dictates these payments, or otherwise, if it's a matter of discretion for department managers as a way to retain employees.
Nope. So that is a payment for years of service. That is in all of the union contracts, but it's also for non-union employees.
Okay.
So you hit a certain level of years, you get a certain amount of money. And this year, I hit my 25th year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Anyone else? Yes.
Just one quick question. In regards to, I know you were working with Mr. Toppin in regards to attracting people of color. Have you had much success with it? I know we have had a few in City Hall,
In
but,
City Hall. We have had success, yes.
Okay.
Yep. You will see the difference,
all right,
yes.
thank you.
And we continue to make progress.
Fantastic, thank you, that was it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Counselor Bowen.
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate the same line of questioning and encourage, when I was looking through seeing those overtime and special projects lines, was hoping that some of that focus over the next year might be around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives. And so hearing that there's some in the executive office budget line, and then potentially space depending on other competing priorities within HR. I think that having that space is important. And then I had another somewhat unrelated question, and it may be more of a finance department question, but it's sort of an HR policy, which is around how the sick leave buyback works across departments, because it seems like one of the most difficult to predict numbers across budgets. And so I wonder if you could just describe how that works for a newbie.
Sure. So the sick leave buyback, the employees, when they retire, they can buy back a portion of their sick time. And so you can speak to that probably better than me, but we don't know when someone's going to retire, and we also don't know how much sick time they're going to be buying back. So that's how it would be unpredictable.
Yeah, and the annual buyback of the small amounts too plays into that.
In the annual,
In December, they buy a week.
oh, okay, well, that's, yes, there's also at the end of the year, city employees can buy up to 5 days of the sick days back.
Just to follow up on that question, if I may, is that a highly variable from year to year number?
For the retirement? Yeah, go ahead.
Speak to it, because you're all gonna, it's great that you're asking this question, because you're all gonna see it as we go through the varying departments, and you're looking at actuals from a year ago, which are up here, and then you see a budget down here, or a zero, and what's going on. The way we manage this is, if we know of employees that regularly take advantage of the end of the year buyback of the 5 days, and we have a number of them that every year, rain or shine, they buy 5 days back. We'll budget that. So you'll see small budgets of $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 within departments within that line. In addition to that, which we alluded to earlier, we have, if someone retires, vacation and sick accruals, they can cash them out depending upon their contract. When they do that, we have a reserve budgeted in our reserve section of the budget, and we transfer those funds down to that department to cover those expenditures as they occur, so that the money doesn't sit there potentially unused within a department budget. It's in a reserve and is used for its intended purpose that the council approves it for. Is that helpful? So you'll see those numbers fluctuate wildly. I mean, some of our bigger departments, we can have 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 employees retire, particularly in our public safety units, and you could have $150,000, $200,000 in buyout costs in a given year. So that's why you see the wide fluctuations.
Counselor Crowley?
Just a quick question to go back on that. Are they capped, or is it,
Yes.
okay, so
There are caps in the amount of sick time and vacation time that they can accrue.
right, yeah,
So therefore, it caps the buyout.
okay, all right,
Sorry,
thank you.
trying to give you the.
Counselor. Thank you very much, Ms. Dictera, and congratulations, and thank you for your years of service to the
Thank
city.
you. It's been a joy working for the city.
Terrific. Next at bat, Mr. Gelano. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here. I wanted to first thank Betty Patterson, Assistant Purchasing Agent. Betty is a godsend. Couldn't do my job without her, and I think she's helped some of you folks along the way.
This is on page 36 of the budget book.
My budget is pretty cut and dry, and I guess go through it, and if you had any questions. There's a couple of lines here where you'll see some reduced cost. One of the things we've been doing is our copier use. We generally lease our machines for 3 years. Historically, we would get new machines. We have found that the machines are in good working order, and we just release our same machines. It saves us quite a bit of money. Office supplies, we continue to give folks what they need to get their job done, but we try to keep a lid on it and don't let them in our drawers. If they go in the drawers, they tend to say, oh, while I'm here, I'll take one of those and one of those. So, again, it's a budget that I can live with, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Committee members? Any questions for Mr. Gelano? No? Counselors? Counselor Bowen?
Thank you. Actually, related to the questions in the HR department, I noticed the advertising line is steady or decreasing, and wondered if, with the recommendations coming out of the racial equity audit, that we advertise more widely RFPs and calls for services to attract a wider range of bidders, if you've thought about.
Yeah, we're taking a look at that. The other thing we're trying to do is, the state has some places where everything has to be advertised on. So it's combis, it's a central register, it's goods and services. So part of what our hope is to educate folks to say, listen, if you just come here, you'll find it. You know, instead of trying to find other ways to advertise things, we're hoping if we can direct people there, they will get all the information, and not only the information from Beverly, but they'll get it from every other city in town.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up, I think it would be interesting to explore what that sort of interim outreach looks like if you want to encourage people to end up on combis and some of the other standardized systems, how you identify people to encourage to get there and how you sort of broaden that net.
It's a question that not only we're working on. I can tell you I'm a board member of the Massachusetts Association of Public Purchasing Officials, and throughout the state, we're all trying to find the best way to get to the end result that we all want to get to.
Counselor Bowen? Sweeney, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we look alike, so. I am just
Striking
curious.
resemblance, yeah.
I'm curious, Mr. Gelano, I know the city's received a large amount of federal funding throughout the pandemic, notably the ARPA funding. Given that that's, multi-million-dollar stream of funding coming into the city, with some complexities between where state and federal procurement regulations apply, I would certainly be interested in hearing how that has impacted your department's operations and what you foresee as challenges for this coming fiscal year as we really start to deploy some significant portions of that $13 million or so ARPA award.
Yep. So come to Fort Devens, MAPO that I'm talking about on June 22nd, we're actually having a conference to try to, there's a lot of unanswered questions. 2 CFR 200, which is federal, what is the requirements? There's very little guidance out there from what we can see as to how to do this. We want to make sure we do it right. And, every city in town does. So, it will have an impact. We'll work closely with everybody to try to do it successfully and do it properly and do it legally.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Counselors, anyone else? Mr. Gelano, we'll let you off easy this time.
Thank you.
See you in a year.
I'll go
Thank
get
you
your
very
water.
much.
I'll go get your water for you. Thank you, Counselor.
Good to see you. Next, our Veteran Service Agent, Mr. Burnchief. Good evening. Page number 105.
Everybody, before we started, I just wanted to recognize the two gentlemen who are here, Corey Paulette and Chuck Clark. The Veteran Council's been hit pretty hard this year with illnesses and injuries. I was out due to a major injury which required a bicep reattachment, and my collarbone had to be redone and a bunch of tears in my shoulder. Jerry Jalebi has been, under the weather pretty severely, and Chuck and Corey came in and stepped up to the plate. And for those of you that know me, I'm pretty direct, and Corey's pretty direct, and he and I in the past have been pretty much at each other regularly when we were doing things, but I wanted to make sure he gets recognized, and I just want to say, Corey, I thank you for stepping in, man. I really appreciate it. Corey and Chuck arranged all the flagging because I had medical appointments. So the flagging of the cemeteries this year, they took over for me. A lot of the communications with the veteran posts, they helped step in with Paul Lance and Ron Janest. So it's, again, dude, thank you. So that's all I have on that.
Thank you very much. Is there anything in general you'd like to talk about the work you do following this Memorial Day weekend?
Oh, as of now, we've been proceeding pretty well with getting our restoration workshop up and running. We've moved the office up to next to the hospital in the old dog officer building. Mike Collins' guys have been great. They got out there, they helped paint the building, so it's no longer a rough-looking establishment. It's a nice bright blue building, which is easily identifiable, especially for our older veterans. We now have available parking up there. We're close to the hospital, the housing that's over there, along with the nursing facilities, easy highway access. There is a bus route that goes there, so we've pretty much eliminated any of the issues of people getting to us. Obviously, with the construction down by the park, parking was just unattainable, and it was creating a huge bottleneck over by the MBTA parking. The new locations also afforded us proper waiting room, an area where we can actually eat lunch, and then provide more privatized service for when people are coming in, because we do deal with HIPAA. There are a few more plans moving forward. Again, Mike Collins is on it, but as Mike Collins is, he's only one man, so he'll get it there when he gets there. So. But again, his guys stepped in, got the building looking presentable, and we're just doing the rest of the touch-up work on our own. In terms of budget items, as you can see, we are pretty much level funded for the veterans benefits. There was a slight reduction. We will probably be giving back almost 50% of the Chapter 115 budget this year, just maybe a little bit less. The packet I gave you is just for your knowledge, because the budget item, that is money that was infused from the state into our budget due to the interest rate rises, and so that is to go out to the veterans. That budget item will be going out at the end of this month to help offset the delay we have usually with the July budget meetings to get the checks out. So that way the veterans will not be waiting for an extended period of time, because we usually push them out, the beginning of the week. The supply lines, again, thankfully we will be able to get the supply lines now for the D2 biological. You've all heard me talk on this before. Based off of that, we'll be able to do about 5,000 stones on a cycling rotation every other year, which will keep the biological and the growths down, which will begin that initial process of getting the cemeteries back up to par, making them look good, getting us in compliance with what the state asks for. So that's a great step in the right direction. Everything else is just obviously cost increases with everything: Memorial Day, flag costs, general items. One of the other items that we created was the state now is more supportive on the fuel costs. We have liaisoned with all the most of the fuel companies in the area, where we will work directly with them to ensure that anybody who is on Chapter 115 is applying for NASCAP and is getting the fuel benefits, which this year alone, we weren't able to implement that to the last 6 months of the year, but we saved $22,000 just on fuel benefits. Next year, we're probably going to save around $56,000 at the current rate. So that'll be money that'll probably go back in the general fund and/or, possible services that we may need to increase within, my budget for supplies or working equipment, stuff like that. So, we kept a very, very tight rein on the budget this year, and it's paid off. So there'll be a sizable amount going back to the general fund, correct, Ryan? So that's where we're at.
Thank you very much. Members of the subcommittee? Yes, Council President.
Thank you. Mr. Parent Chief, thank you for being here, and also Chuck and Corey, thank you for the work that you've been doing to fill those gaps that we just heard about. It's very much appreciated. I don't have a specific question, just wanted to mention, Mr. Parent Chief, you alluded to it, your new space, your new office space by the hospital, and just wanted to thank you for welcoming me to come see your space, the work that you're doing with the tombstone restoration, and the work that you do for veterans in our community that happens in that space. And just if other counselors, if you haven't had a chance to see the Veterans Services new home, I would definitely encourage you to go. I learned a lot from meeting with you and your team there, and so just thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to echo Council President's comments. We had a chance Friday to see your new quarters and also review the work that's being done on tombstone restoration and so forth. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. I look forward to working with you some more on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And I know I did have a chance to meet with you a couple of years ago when I first started, but I haven't seen the new space, so I'm due for a visit. But to that end, when we spoke and met a couple of years ago, you had mentioned hiring an assistant or somebody in terms of staffing, and
Yes, we are making progress on that. Brian and the mayor have budgeted for that this year. We have to just work with HR. It will be a part-time position for now. We obviously have to give more of the analytics of workload because, we want to be able to show the need. One, mostly for the administrative work, because what most people don't understand is that I'm not just dealing with federal benefits. I'm dealing with federal, state, housing, military regulations. Right now we're dealing with a congruent with a military group out of Colorado that essentially harmed a constituent that we're working directly with Seth Moulton's office on. These are things that take a lot of time and a lot of administrative work, a lot of liaisoning with offices, which obviously I can't, excuse me, which I cannot do on my own accord. I need, because if I have, for instance, we just had a gentleman who passed away. The police department contacted me. He was found in his housing. Everything stops. That becomes priority. So someone needs to be there to pick up that work that's happening so I can focus on the immediate emergency. So it's the 2 is 1, 1 is none rule. If there's just me, again, when I had to go in for surgery, there was essentially, you had an entire department down. But there was a lot of back and forth with the mayor's office, and he has now, he heard my case, and he has agreed, we are moving in the right direction, which is great. But again, this isn't something that we can just, as has been explained to me by Bryant and HR, we can't just jump into that. We have to show the need, show the development, and so we're moving in a very good direction now.
Oh, so there's no increase reflected in the budget?
There is an increase in the temp helpline. So I believe that jumped to, sorry.
The 27% increase, that's?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that keeps the individuals there because they are on Social Security disability. And if we go over a certain amount, then they would lose their health benefits. So when we're making it part-time, we have a very delicate balance until we create the full-time. So,
Understood.
Again, it's the best possible situation. Again, we're coming in with an inflation issue. So, as I've always said, constituents come first. We've got to make sure we don't overextend ourselves. And, you know, my office is one of the smallest, so we can adapt the quickest.
I completely support that, and I appreciate that response, and I was asking from a place of supporting, making sure your office was staffed at the level it was needed, because I have heard wonderful things from my constituents about the services, and very grateful to have you in our community, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Feldman. Councilor Rotundo.
One quick question. The supply line, 288%. I know just a couple of things that you're planning on purchasing. I know you and I have talked about it, but I just kind of want to see where you are updated on that.
So the main items for the increase is the D2 biological solution. Again, this is the only, it's the only one that's environmentally safe. That's issue number one. The safer an item, the more qualified it is, the more expensive it's going to be. Obviously, costs have increased, so it's looking at $200 per every 5-gallon container. We factored in about $8,000 per year. I actually have the math, if you give me 1 second, so I can give you those numbers directly. So at $8,000, that's about 200 gallons per year. That's about 5,000 stones. Then we're doing a 2-year cycle, and that will keep us on par, going through every cemetery, getting it done on a regular basis, and coming up with a rotational system. Obviously, we are also confined to seasonal and temperature, so we only have a limited window to do it. Other items are obviously, if we're yanking up the markers that are sunk back in the 70s, they weren't placed correctly. Mike Collins and Mike Bouchard and all those guys have done a great job trying to prevent any future problems by making the concrete bases, but we still have thousands of them that are not done right. We were in North Beverly yesterday, and we were yanking, markers that have sunk 6-7 inches out of the ground because the grass is just overgrown. Concrete's expensive, so we have to use a specific concrete, which Mike Bouchard has informed me of. It's a 4,000 psi concrete, so it doesn't break and due to the weather and climate. So again, that has to be purchased by the pallet. So cost, since it generally falls under my budget line, I purchase it. They then produce the bases. So that's really how the budget line is going to move. Again, if we can, our habit, again, it's kind of a Marine Corps thing. If I can pull out the trash or make something work that didn't work, we'll do that first. Half my office is recycled equipment. Half the stuff hanging up in there is like someone was throwing out a computer monitor mount. It's mine now. I'm gonna go use that because now I don't have to buy another one.
Thank you. Councilor Rotundo, you're referring to on page 106, line 55161.
Correct.
Supplies? Yeah, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Byrne, Chief? Yes, Councilor Bowman.
Thank you. So you mentioned that in this fiscal year, you're expecting to turn back some unused funds from the budget and potentially more next year based on benefits being reimbursed at essentially a higher overall rate, or?
So so Chapter 115, the city has to budget by law. We have to pay out the Chapter 115 budget, which is then reimbursed at 75% as long as we are in compliance. Within that budget, there is medical, housing, and heating assistance. So by working directly with NASCAP and National Grid, we bypassed the 1-800. We are now in direct contact with their regional managers. We'll contact them, provide the addresses, not the names, just the addresses of people who are eligible for Chapter 115. They will then ensure that those addresses are then included into their fuel assistance. They'll send out the forms, and we've also made a requirement that everyone has to apply for that form. So we've already informed NASCAP it's coming, and then when the paperwork's there, they're ready to just move on it. But also with NASCAP, you have to apply within the certification window. So that's a big push that we've started, is making sure that everyone's applying on time. The second part was the Part B buy-in, which the state has now made mandatory. If you have Part B, it's usually paid out right this year. I think it's $144, depending on how much you paid in Social Security. That's times a month, times by 60. Now with the Part B buy-in, the state, because we have Mass Health, now takes over that. We don't have to pay it. So that's where a lot of the savings are coming from. In terms of other savings, obviously, we've been developing relationships with Tufts Dental Plan, Kowalski Dental, making sure we find dentist office that will accept the state rates, provide the proper treatment. Tufts was very good. We had one dental case which was exceedingly expensive. I think it took about 4 years for us to get it finalized, but throughout that, Tufts, with us constantly staying in contact, Tufts found that they were overpaid because they had to change the treatment plan. They sent the money back. So if you were to go through the munis, you'll see that a lot of money has come back in. Veterans who we got their Social Security, their benefits fixed, would get lump sum payments. They would make payments back. So we've actually been getting payments back from veterans because we've been getting them onto other systems. So that compiled with the fuel and the fuel savings are going to be significant.
Thank you. And it sounds like that we have to budget at a set amount. Your team is doing a lot of work to help ensure that veterans are getting the services they need at, in the end, lower cost to the city because they're taking advantage of the full array of programs out there.
Yeah, we will chase down anything before we start spending taxpayer money.
It is appreciated. And I guess my only kind of closing question / point would be for some of the additional projects beyond the grave restoration work that's included in the budget, some of the other sites around the city, memorials that we have, additional work that's been requested by veterans, is some of that work that could happen if there's money remaining in the budget as a result of that great work seeking benefits, as opposed to turning it all back to the general fund?
That I would refer to Bryant, because in terms of allocating money for the next fiscal year off of return money, I wouldn't be able to answer that correctly.
Yeah, we don't know in advance, but the short answer is yes, we can do that kind of work. It's important to note, though, that because these Chapter 115 expenditures are reimbursed at 75%, if we turn it back to the general fund's really only benefiting 25% of that, right? Because you lose the revenue on the other side as well. So if you spend it, it's spending 100% of it. If it turns back, you save 25% of it.
Yeah, there's no way I could have answered that right.
Anyone else? Hearing none. Mr. Parent-Chief, thank you very much for your time and your service.
Thank you.
Next, Mr. Ailes. Yeah, where do you want to start? Directly on page 24?
Sure.
How do you want to work through your different departments?
Yeah, I think there's a few sections that I would probably need to speak to. Obviously, all the finance departments, and I don't know how deep you want to go tonight, but there's also some back-end sections like debt, pension, healthcare, things of that nature that I would probably. But I'll be here every night, so we can handle that any night you choose, Mr. Chairman.
I'd be happy to. We're making good time this evening, so I'd be happy to take a good swing at that this evening, actually.
Okay.
And sort of have the overview of that as well.
Sure. Okay. So starting on page 24, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 departments are contained in this section of the book. Our collectors, our treasurers is one office. The auditors is a second office. The assessing department's a third, and information technology is the fourth. In addition to that, purchasing, although it is a separate section of the budget, resides within the finance department as well. So going through these all, they're pretty straightforward. There are a few adds, and we'll probably, they jump out at you as you see them. The first section here, the accounting section, The only real difference in this budget is in two areas. The first is on page 24, and that's the second line down. That is the budget for the Assistant Finance Director position. I am engaged in scheduled interviews this week, so we'll be taking our first crack at the candidates that have applied. The second area that tends to fluctuate, unfortunately up every year, is the very last line on page 26. We house all of the insurance costs for the city that are specific to city in general. There are some other smaller insurance costs that reside within, like, the airport budget, related to some boards and officers insurance that they have and things of that nature. But the bulk of the city's insurance policies reside in this budget as well. So that increase is budgeted per the predetermined schedules that we've already received for next year, and that budget should be sufficient to cover the increases that are projected. Do you want to stop there, Mr. Chairman,
Why don't we
and
just
talk about that
see if-
department first?
Take it section by section that way.
Okay.
If there are any questions for the committee members or council on the accountant's office? Seeing none, we can go ahead and take the next section, which is IT department,
Sure.
page 27.
Yeah, this has been an area, we've talked about a lot over the past few years. It's really come to light through the pandemic that there's opportunity for enhancements throughout our operations technologically. You've heard from Mr. Barber about some of the software packages we're implementing throughout government, which should help the experience of the end user, the taxpayer, as well as a lot of our operations internally, streamlining that, making things more accurate. Last year, FY22, we were able to increase our IT department by one individual. That's contained in the third line down under IT help. His name is Wei Wen, and if you haven't met him, I'd encourage you to go down. He's a great addition to that team, and he's pretty hilarious too. I like talking to him a lot. Anyway, that's why you see the actuals of 2021 practically double when you look at that compared to FY23. It's because of that additional staff member. The other thing that can fluctuate from time to time is the last line on page 27, which is Edp Services. This is effectively our licensing fees for all of the systems that we use, just about all the systems that we use throughout government. The largest one being our Munis accounting system, which every department in the city uses for revenues, for expenditures, for payroll processing. And then the system that Mr. Barber had been speaking about called Central Square is contained within here as well. We have a redundant system, so we pay for two trunks into our database system downstairs. We also have off-site backup storage that we maintain in case of disaster recovery. We're well suited to be able to be back up online in relatively short order. We have a recovery plan for that. In addition to that, the team downstairs are some of the best that I've ever worked with in terms of network administration, firewall administration, and they take a great deal of pride in being on the cutting edge of everything that's going on in that realm, which is really helpful when you read about some of the other government entities and private companies that are vulnerable to everything that's going on in the world. But definitely, we are in good hands with the team downstairs. Are there any maybe budget-related questions that I could help address?
Council President?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ailes. I have a question on line 53046, which was the bottom of page 27, which you alluded to, the different fees for service. You may not be able to fully answer this right now, but I recall when Mr. Barber was talking about Central Square and sort of leaning into that system, he talked about the potential to have it take over what QSend does for us now, or for anyone who might be watching at home, that's the My Beverly, where people can report problems.
Yep.
And so I'm just curious, do you have a sense if that might be part of our sort of city vision? And if so, it looks to me like that could amount to a savings of about $9,000. I'm rounding up, obviously, potentially, if we were to move away from QSend.
Yeah. Great point. Yeah, that is the intention. And when we migrate any functional process from one place to another, we try to overlap the two. And that's why you see an annual licensing fee for that Q-Send as well. We're not going to flip the switch until it's ready to do so, and we test it and we kick the tires really hard on it. So that's why you see that doubling. But next year, hopefully, if everything goes smooth, that particular cost may go away.
Thank you. That makes sense to me that they would overlap for a time. And was just curious about sort of the longer view, which you very helpfully provided. Would it be possible to ask one follow-up? This is another one that may call for speculation in a way that you can't answer. But I'm curious if anywhere in this budget, if you have a sense of, I know one of the things our IT department has been trying to work towards, and I know there are parts that are hard to get, but making sure that City Council Chambers is updated for better hybrid meetings regularly, which is something that, as you said, the pandemic revealed lots of areas where we could improve. Do you have a sense of whether that's reflected in this budget, the upgrades to the chambers for that purpose?
Yeah, so without knowing the specific purchases that would need to be made, this is probably a budget that does have a fair amount of flexibility in it. We were looking at the EDP line, that line doesn't, but when you look at page 28, within the, bear with me for a second here, the very last line in the budget, the purchasing of equipment, I mean, that does two things. One, it allows us to tackle new initiatives mid-year, and utilize those resources to do just exactly what you're talking about. But it also provides for a safety net. We have servers that go down occasionally. We need UPS backups, all those things. It's an expensive environment down there, and it's one that you need to react very timely when there's an issue. And so their ability to go out and purchase switches as they need and everything, it's important to maintain that flexibility.
Thank you very much,
Yep.
Mr. Ailes. Thank you.
Councilor St. Hilaire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Brian. I think, just reflecting back on our conversation that we had I don't know, it was a month ago now as a finance subcommittee, and I think a lot of us agreed that we generally need an IT upgrade across the city, and I think we had talked a lot about the website and data visualization and transparency tools. And I guess I just wanted to comment, as a counselor, I haven't seen a lot of investment in IT over the years. Where do you see this heading? Cybersecurity is a growing concern. I think that the technology that Mr. Barber is implementing, I think, unlocks a lot of capabilities and efficiencies across government. I just wanted to comment, I would love to see more in the future, and if you had any thoughts about the general direction of our IT planning.
Yeah, I'd say that we've been going the last 2 years at a pretty breakneck speed. With the pandemic came the need to effectively take all of our operations and implement them through a technology mechanism, right? Within a matter of weeks, we had to completely do the same job remotely, all of our employees. That required bandwidth, that required system upgrades, that required all sorts of investments that the team down there have been diligently planning for and implementing over the past 2 years. Entire redundancy in the network was implemented over the last year. We've also upgraded our entire communication system. That's phones throughout city government, all on a redundant fiber loop throughout the city. We have one of the I would say regionally best systems in that sense. You talked about a couple things there. The other thing you mentioned was cybersecurity and investing in that regard. I think a lot of times when people look at technology, they tend to focus on what they can see, right? But anyone that's been, as you have in a big organization, understand that a lot of the investment and a lot of what really makes the stuff that you see on the screen work and work well is done behind the scenes. And that's where I think we excel, and it's not always something that my neighbor, the taxpayers out there are able to see all the time, but it's something that it really is in the wheelhouse of the gentleman downstairs. So they've done a lot of network infrastructure enhancements, firewall enhancements. They're regularly updating that stuff to make sure that we're at the cutting edge of, everything we see. I mean, it wasn't 12 hours after the banks in Ukraine crashed that our IT director's on the text with me saying, I think I got this covered, don't worry about a thing. I've already looked at what they did. I've already read all the reports on it. And so, I mean, they pride themselves on being on top of this stuff. And that's not always stuff you see, right? You go on the website, you don't know that's going on. But they are really good. And I would also add, we've done independent audits, I guess you would call it, of our infrastructure and of the many facets of technology. And sure, there are areas for improvement. But most of those areas tend to be those outward-facing pieces that I think we're all in agreement we can do some more work on. We did upgrade our website over the past year as well, and a lot of this was funded through some of the CARES funds because it was necessary to continue to deliver quality government services. Now that money's gone away, we need to sit down and figure out what are the next few steps to get us up over that hump of having those good tools that are forward-facing to the general public. I think we're closer than we've ever been.
Appreciate the update. Thank you.
If I may, a couple of points. One is, having spent some time down there, the esprit de corps down there is fantastic. And I have been reassured by sort of a fair amount of wonky talk with Russ Fisk over cybersecurity efforts and infrastructure that the city has. So I feel like we're in pretty good shape that way. And I really appreciate the work that they do, and I'm very glad they've got a physical upgrade to their quarters from what it was down in the basement. Following up on Councilor St. Hilaire's comment about sort of better communication through the website and conversations you and I have had about transparency, communicating municipal finance and budget. Is there any particular plan in place? You and I have had this conversation, so I'll press you again to try to change or add on to the website to produce a more clear way of communicating with the general public around the city budget?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably more of a finance question than a technological. Well, I guess it could go either way.
They're kind of
they're intertwined there, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there's room for improvement. We had this discussion when I came before you all a few months ago about an assistant finance director. That's going to free up capacity within the finance department. There are holes we need to fill with that capacity, but in addition to that, depending upon the skill sets of the successful candidate, and when we're able to reassess the skill sets of existing staff, there will be the ability to focus some attention on those types of things, for sure. If it's not me, it may be the assistant finance director, it may be a combination, it may be a team, but we do need to improve. I don't disagree with you there.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Feldman.
Yes, one quick question. And I'm not sure if I missed this when there was the Central Square discussion. In the budget, it says 50%. Is that, how many years, is that for the year, or is it, explain why it's 50%?
That's 50% of the annual cost of the system for FY23. Now, there are some implementation costs of that second component that Mr. Barber spoke about that are contained within that 71,000. However, the other 50% of the annual cost for FY23 resides partly in the Water Enterprise Fund and partly in the Sewer Enterprise Fund. And the rationale behind that is because the system, as it's designed, will manage projects and infrastructure across the city. So a significant portion of that infrastructure is water-related and sewer-related, and therefore it's an appropriate use to utilize the ratepayer revenue to support that technology. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Councilor Bowen?
Thank you. Just to follow up on a couple of my fellow councilors' questions, I was curious if there was any plan to use ARPA funds for some of the continued needs. You mentioned CARES funds had helped with upgrades to the public-facing side of our IT department over the last year or two. And given the need for remote meetings to happen all over the city for a lot of different committees, and for some of the potential further infrastructure upgrades, now that so many changes have been made and we can sort of see what's working and what's not, just curious, because that wouldn't be reflected here, but could potentially happen. So I'm curious where those conversations stand.
Yeah, I'll admit, I think I need to be better versed on what it is we're actually, talking about with this project and what it entails. It's probably a combination of financial resources and kind of a game plan or business plan. I'd be happy to report back on the issue when I get a better sense of what it will entail. But sure, ARPA could be a eligible use. And if not within one of the categories, it could certainly fall within the lost revenue sector of the funding, because it is general government services.
Maybe just to follow up, it might be helpful at some point outside of this budget discussion to also meet with Mr. Fisk and sort of hear from the department where some of those, if we have sort of a policy direction in mind around both the infrastructure for more two-way communication in city business and the sort of use of that infrastructure, which is a larger conversation. If we could, have that conversation with the council, with committees, given that it's both a how does it get funded conversation and a what is it and how could we make it happen conversation.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking for somewhat of a kind of formal discussion in an open setting, I'm sure you're aware, you're on the Charter Commission, right? That's the council's ability to call any department head, before its body, if the body so chooses. So we'd be more than happy to come and have that discussion, of course.
Okay, good. Anyone else on IT? If not, we'll move along to Assessor's Office. Page 29.
So the Assessors Department, right now, how we're structured is we have 3 individuals that work in the main office that handle a variety of tasks related to motor vehicles, certain site visits for certain types of assessing components, as well as anyone that comes to the window, abatements, exemptions, deferrals, things of that nature. And I know I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg there because they do a ton out of that office. In addition to that, Terry DeBlacy oversees the office, manages the office on a day-to-day basis, and does a lot of the valuation work that goes into the reporting that they are responsible for. In addition to that, we have a 3-member body, the Board of Assessors. Peter Karen serves as the Chief Assessor. He also is a 16-hour per week employee, and that's where he shows as a part-time employee here in this budget. So I just wanted to give you that sense of how the office is structured. I think if you look at some of our neighboring cities and towns, they're all structured a little bit differently. We're fortunate we've got a very strong skill set, so I think that affords us the ability to kind of pull off of some of the staffing needs that would be typical within that department. Terry's incredible, her staff's incredible, and Peter Karen was the former president of the Board of Assessors for the state. He knows his stuff cold, and so we're fortunate in that regard because any other city or town pretty much has a full-time assessor in addition to the staff we're talking about. I give you that context just to give you a sense of kind of how they're staffed there. The only real difference year over year in budget for this has to do with the required work. Mr. Perry made mention of this in his opening remarks. The required work that we need to do every 5 years pertaining to our assessed values. They need to either go out themselves or hire an independent party to go out and do a full measure and list, they call it. And they call it that because the parties literally go out and look at every property and measure it and make sure that what we're containing within our database in terms of assessment is fairly appropriate. And they'll certify that, and we'll present the certification to the Division of Local Services so that the tax rating authority, Local Services, feels comfortable that we're consistent in our methodology, that we're fair in our methodology. And so that's a significant increase. That work will happen over 2 years, FY23 as well as FY24. They technically have already started a little bit of their work, but you won't see it here, that we're covering it through their existing budget. So the remainder of the work will be done in FY23 and FY24 at a cost of $157,500 per year. So it's a $315,000 project over the 2-year period. And then in FY25, you'll see this line go back down. Just for reference, that's the last line in the budget on page 30.
Councilor Flowers, Councilor St. Hilaire, any questions? Councilor Rotunda?
Mr. Ailes, just look on the reevaluation, and when looking at the comments, Cummins appraisal 20,000, I'm assuming you purposely, that's budgeted every year just because it's such a large and unique property throughout the, to really get a fair assessment, so to speak, and will not come under the full evaluation of $315,000. That will be separate from the $315,000, correct?
Correct. It's a separate appraisal that's done. It's important with very unique properties like that. We've also hired in the past individuals to come in and look at utility fixed asset valuing, right? Because that's part of the tax levy as well. But you get that expertise in, they evaluate the unique property, and that allows you to fairly assess that property. Because if you're off a little bit, let's say you come down a little bit in the assessment, well, the value of those taxes ultimately get distributed back to everyone else. So we really want to maintain that consistent fairness among all our properties, and sometimes we need certain expertise to help us do that.
That's it, thank you.
Any other questions? I did have a question, following up on a little bit on Councilor Rotunda's question. I know for a long time we seem to have a annual discussion, shall we say, with the Cummings Center regarding fair valuation, and if we're going through evaluation again. What is the current status of the understanding, if you will, on the assessed value of the Cummings Center vis-a-vis the city?
I don't want to misspeak. Let me check with our Assessors Department, and I can certainly get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Councilor Feldman.
One quick question, and this is kind of tied to procurement, I guess. For line number or supplies, under office supplies and the copier lease, how is this lease separate from the procurement, the copier use leases that Mr. Gelano talked about?
Yeah, so if you walk through the many offices in the building, certain offices have very specific copiers for whatever it is they're doing. A lot of offices that have high volume tend to have one within their individual office, and then there are shared ones throughout the building and throughout larger buildings, the library and things like that. So Mr. Gelano procures and negotiates all of them, but some of the ones where it's specific to a specific office will remain within their budget as opposed to being shared centrally within the procurement budget.
Okay, that's all, thanks.
Anyone else? Yes, please, Mr. Perry.
Thank you. Very quickly, Mr. Ailes touched upon a little bit the amount of resources in the assessor's office. From my own experience, it's really weak there. Having a part-time principal assessor, if you will, and they're doing a great job. They really are. And I want to caution the counselors, if there's some changes in staffing down there, given their institutional knowledge, I'm not so sure we can replace it with existing resources. I had an opportunity this year to talk to a retired assessor who oversaw the assessing in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Picked her brain a little bit about that. She was a little surprised at the amount of resources we do allocate here. I mean, we're going to be okay, but I just want to caution you down the road, if something happens, if somebody retires, if somebody leaves, it may be a little bit different conversation in terms of what we went through with the assistant finance director's role as well. So I just want to bring that to your attention, that it's something that's a little bit of a concern that I have. But as long as we have what we have, I think we'll be good. I just wanted to comment about that, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Thank you. Mr. Ailes, if I may just follow up on that. We have a lot of department heads that have a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge that when they leave, walks out the door. And I don't know, when you have small departments, really what you can do to sort of have the succession plan to take, sort of to address that proactively. How do you deal with an employee who's the head of the department, been there 25 years, and it's a small enough department that they don't really have an equivalent assistant who might then step up?
So this is like management philosophy, right? Question generally. So how do I handle it with my department heads is that I try to stay integrated with the major components of what they're doing, and I try to encourage delegation from time to time so that there's the ability to cross-train, as well as everyone kind of benefits from a broader knowledge of how what I do may affect what Jerry does and how we can work together to kind of learn each other's jobs. So generally, that's what we try to encourage. I mean, what we were talking about with the Assessors Department is what I think every good manager should do, which is you assess the skill sets of the group you're managing, and you assess where the holes are, and you try to get the most out of your employees and encourage their growth into areas to try to create a continuity of services without leaving any holes. But when you do that, right, if any part of that puzzle gets removed, there's a hole. I mean, it's inevitable. So I think what we do well here is we employ very strong, smart employees that are willing to step in certain areas. I can't think of a time any of my staff have ever said, that's not in my job description, I'm not going to do that. They don't. They say, how can we help? We know so-and-so's going out on a leave, and what do you need from me? I'll stay late. I'll do it, And so having a culture that is supportive of that and a kind of peer accountability helps to kind of do that as well. It's not easy, but I think you try to be as efficient as you can, because you never want to be overstaffed, because then it's having too much resources. So it's a balance, constant balance. And it's constantly changing. The landscape's constantly changing. We had, in my departments, we probably had about 5 or 6 turnover in the last year. And we've been real fortunate with who we've hired. We've got some really, really great staff, new hires downstairs that are just, chomping at the bit to contribute. So it's a good problem to have in some ways.
All right, thank you. Go
I
ahead.
would just offer my day job opinion on that as well, and I would say that that's something every organization is facing right now with the great resignation. And one suggestion I might have is we recently put together a single-person dependency plan where we've got somebody who, the organization can't lose, and then it's breaking down what are the components and how you're going to deal with it if that person walks out the door. It's pretty eye-opening, and you realize that maybe some things you can train on, maybe some things you can outsource, but and some jobs are more replaceable than others. So best of luck. I'm happy to help.
I'd like to follow up with you on that if we could, sure.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Good. Yes, Councilor Rotundo.
Since we went this direction on the chief assessor's position, which is Mr. Karen, obviously he's retired, and I know he does have an intricate part of this particular department, but he does have a wealth of knowledge. Which poses the thing is, he could leave in a few weeks, a few months, whatever the case may be. And I know the structure was changed years ago in order to, when he retired, he came in as the chief assessor, and Mr. Blasey stayed as the assistant assessor. is there being thought put into this as an exit plan? Because it is something that's probably gonna become sooner rather than later. And even from a budget standpoint, we're looking at 45,000. We know, and you know it, we see it. You know, you're gonna be budgeting that for 120,000, 110,000, 115,000. You're looking for a $70,000 increase. That could even happen this year.
Yeah, it's something that we talk about internally. Fortunately, we've got 3 board members that are all very good at their job. Frank Golden, we've met, and Rich Scanlon are. They're the best. They're the best in the state. We probably have the best board of assessors in the state. I mean, I don't know them all, but they all can plug into any aspect of the operations there. So short term, you know, if there were a turnover or someone, Terry, Peter, someone integral to the operations left, we wouldn't be just standing there not knowing what to do. We've got capable individuals that can plug holes short term and provide us the ability to be a little more strategic about, given what's left on the table, what types of holes we need to fill.
Very good, thank you.
Councilor Bone.
Thank you. I have a question that goes a little bit in a different direction, but the assessment process brings it to mind, which is about the payments in lieu of taxes. And so we can talk about it from the revenue perspective, because I know it hasn't really increased over time.
Yep.
But I'm curious what role the assessors play. Are they looking at the values of those properties and what taxes would be if they were taxed as part of the negotiation around payment in lieu of taxes, or?
So there's 2 categories in my mind. I'm going to simplify it because I'm just an accountant. But one area that we receive payment in lieu of taxes has to do with personal property taxation of solar installations, okay? So that actually is a taxable asset that we as a city negotiate an agreement in advance of coming to whatever type of development agreement we may do. And we've got that with all of our developments. That allows us to give them certainty in the terms of what their payments are going to be, and then they use that certainty then to create their finance structures and have some certainty. The other group, which is in the pilot program, has to do with entities that are not taxable, right? So your colleges, certain institutions that may, like churches maybe, I think there's some other groups too. I'm looking at Mr. Perry here, but there's a few of them. Some of them approach us and say, we'd like to contribute, and we think, you know, the services we receive from the city warrant some sort of a payment. That's always the best kind of negotiation, right? Because it's, you know, kind of a social conscious of the organization. So some of our larger institutions do that on a regular basis. And yes, we engage in kind of soft negotiations around that. Usually it involves the mayor and the head of whatever organization. Sometimes I'll be involved in it as well. The assessors, although they ultimately structure a pilot program, they have no obligation to tax that entity. So therefore, you know, it's a win-win for them, is the way they look at it. There are, in some instances, some debate about taxability for certain organizations, and that's when the assessors will get involved. If there's certain non-business related income type things that may be seen as taxable, they'll certainly explore that in good faith with the organization, hopefully. But, you know, that's kind of a unique situation that pops up from time to time. Did I answer your question? Because I just felt like I was rambling there for a little bit.
Yes, no, you answered it well. And I think part of what I was thinking is just how we as a city understand the services that an organization might want to be providing some compensation for, and sort of how we approach thinking about what's fair in that conversation. So I appreciate the explanation of the process, and was just thinking about, do we have any metrics on our side to look at, you know, based on the value of the land they occupy or the number of people that they serve in the city, what that looks like. certainly a difficult thing to measure, especially when you don't actually have legal authority to
Right,
enforce it. So it was more a speculative question to begin with.
There are nuances to it as well. Like, there's a particular organization, I won't name them, but they're an educational organization. And rather than purchase land and build, say, dormitories, they actually choose to rent commercial properties and residential properties for their students. And that allows us to tax the entity because it's a for-profit entity. And so there are other ways that I think organizations are conscious about how they contribute. It's not always about the dollar. Sometimes it's about what they're providing in terms of service or community value that is important to our community, right? So.
Interesting. Any more questions? We'll go to Treasurer Collector's Office. Page 31.
I believe of all the departments, this is the one that is most straightforward, I think. The only real increases I can think of off the top of my head have to do with contractual obligations for salary. There might be one or two other slight modifications, but nothing real material.
Yeah, they're within a few $1,000s.
Yeah. It's a pretty standard operation, the treasurer. You know, we buy check stock, we buy toner, we, bring in we send the same amount of bills every year just about, and same amount of staff.
Committee members, any questions? Counselors, any questions? Okay. Mr. Ailes, do you want to address either any enterprise or revenue schedules?
I'm happy to. I think the enterprise funds on the schedule I looked.
Pretty much by department head.
Yeah, there are department heads that aid in the management of those. So it's probably appropriate to have Mike Collins or Gloria Bullion, our airport manager.
Okay, and
Mary Ann Holak.
all right, and in the revenues, at the beginning, do you want to go through those?
Sure, happy to. I know Mr. Perry's comments spoke to a lot of these, and what we're aiming to do this fiscal year is really get ourselves back to a pre-pandemic level in many regards in terms of anticipated revenues. And so that's what we attempted to do here. I know we talked a little bit about the levy as well and how that's portrayed here in the budget.
Yeah, this actually on page 2 addresses the pilot payments as well. Councilor St. Hilaire.
Mr. Ailes, so I know we talked a little bit about the 2.5% increase. Yeah, I was very happy to see last year the decision to go to 1.5%. It struck me, I wasn't on the council at the time, but it struck me that the decision was based on the fact that home values were rising, and there was a, understanding that people's real increase was going to be much higher. It seems to me that that's still the case, in given inflation and all the other pressures that residents are facing. Just curious why the decision wasn't the same as it was last year to not go to the full 2.5%.
Yeah, well, I mean, last year, there were a number of factors, right? The new growth came in higher than we anticipated. We backed off the overlay reserve. We had enough reserve remaining that we chewed into that to be able to keep additional money in taxpayers' pockets. That money, and I want to be clear here, that money is also going back to residents effectively this coming year, even with a 2.5% increase. Because had the city chose to go up 2.5% last year, they would be that much higher to start with this year and then go 2.5% from there. That's not the case. That $1 million below the levy limit remains in effect. So effectively, we're continuing the tax relief into FY23. The costs are going up, unfortunately. I mean, we all see it every day. We know what's going on out there. We're trying to deliver quality services that our constituents rely on us to deliver. And I don't think there's anyone sitting here that couldn't kind of look at one particular area and say, I think we need to do more there. Do we need to pave more roads? You know, do we, any area of the budget, you know, someone may say we should be doing more in. We were just talking about IT, we were talking about assessing, we were talking about, you know, all these departments we're going to talk about over the next month. We're trying to strike a balance, and, you know, maintaining that tax relief into FY23 felt like the right thing to do, and not try to pull that back. And so in many regards, I view it still as tax relief that we're trying to maintain. I think another thing we need to be mindful of is we understand that it's real money to people that have been going through the pandemic. Their housing prices are rising. Their income may not be rising, right? And what we're facing as a nation could have significant impacts to the household financial dynamic as well. And what I don't want to have happen is to provide additional relief facing a potential recession or inflation, and be forced to have to recoup that relief at a time when individual families are feeling the tightest pinch. And that's kind of a personal, kind of philosophical view I have. So I know we're not able to give relief every year and still maintain the level of services. So something's got to give somewhere, and I think it's just a question of collectively where we think that balance needs to lie.
Yes, please, go ahead.
So I appreciate that explanation. I guess, are there plans, do you think, to recoup the million in excess in the levy at some point in the near future? Anticipate that happening?
When the mayor and I were discussing this last year and proposed this for the first time in the city's history, we knew that it would be difficult to recoup that, I guess you could say, in an environment where residential values are either in line with or rising at a greater rate than commercial values. But in an environment where commercial values are flat and residential values are declining, or commercial values are appreciating at a rate higher than residential values are appreciating, that's an environment that you can begin to recoup that without affecting the residential sector. And so that would be the ideal time to begin doing that if the need was there. But this goes back to your original point. It's more about what level of services we want to provide, because we're not just going to recoup money just because it's there. You know, there needs to be an intended use for it and a value that the taxpayers receive from entrusting us with their money. So there is a scenario that it might make sense to begin to recoup some of that, but we would do it in the least painful, least painful way.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the clarification.
President Flowers, questions? If I may follow up on just a little bit, the excess capacity in the levy would not have to be exercised all in one percentage point. It could be done in increments, correct?
Yep.
And could be done over time. And that's one way you could buffer the recapture if the circumstances seem to be appropriate or call for it.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes, and the reality is that excess levy capacity is not going to stay the same year after year after year. Even though we're budgeting it that way, when we set the tax rate at the end of the year because of rounding, because we don't know the new growth number yet, because we're taking a guess at what we think for the overlay, those are all going to fluctuate a little bit, and they from time to time can create excess levy capacity, or might eat into it by tens of thousands, which is a penny really on the average tax rate or something like that. But it'll fluctuate up and down. It's just a matter of how much.
Okay. Other councilors? Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. My question sort of builds on the balance of where we're expecting revenues to come from and whether there could be space to maintain a further or expand on tax relief, or on the other hand, expand services and keep up with costs. Because going through it seemed like many of the recommendations, or many of the figures of what we're expecting for other revenue categories are very conservative, even compared to what have been expected to be at least very rough years, and in some cases were declines in revenues over the last 3 or 4 years. But even averaging out those last rough patch years, we're planning on lower revenue than average for pretty much everything besides tax revenue, property taxes. And so I was just curious, I know it was discussed to some extent in the financial forecast process, and you shared some trends over time and certain lines that are particularly variable that we want to be more conservative in our estimations on. But given that it's really across the board and it adds up to quite a bit of money, I was just curious what we're anticipating next year that justifies that and therefore forces the higher level of property taxes.
So that's a big question. Generally speaking, any excess revenues that are generated in a given year become available to spend next year, which is how we operate. And we do that because you don't want to spend money in anticipation of it coming in because you can find yourself short at a given time. Some of the larger revenue streams that you're referring to, like motor vehicle excise, for example, that's one that we tend to talk about a lot because it's, I think, one of our larger single source revenue streams. And the problem with that is the timing on when we receive that revenue creates a unnecessary vulnerability that we're managing against. That revenue doesn't come in till the last quarter of the fiscal year, yet it's 5% of your budget. And so if you're spending, assuming a certain level, and it doesn't materialize, you're already spent 3/4 of your budget at that level, and so the reduction or the adjustments you need to make are proportionately greater to balance your budget in the given fiscal year. So how we manage that, for example, just taking one, is we budget that low to a level that, looking back over 5 or 6 years, feels comfortable enough that we're going to hit. And when we bring in excess revenue, if some of it isn't needed for other revenue sources that came in under what we projected, that money goes to free cash, which gets certified in the fall, and we come before, the administration comes before the council to then reappropriate those funds. So it's not as if the money doesn't get used, it's that we know how much we can spend before we spend it, as opposed to spending it in anticipation of knowing how much we have. It's like buying a new car in anticipation of your bonus that you're going to receive, in December, like Chevy Chase in Christmas Vacation, right?
Be the month club.
I saw you smiling, Councilor St. Hilaire. I knew what you were thinking. So we're just trying to be very mindful and cautious before we obligate those funds. Now, a fair debate to have is the free cash use, right? We've spent already this year a couple million. We're coming before you in the coming council meeting requesting additional appropriations. That will bring that free cash level down to a point which, now that we've realized motor vehicle excise tax, and we know where it's going to come in at, we know how much is going to get replenished back into the bucket, so that we're mindful of our balance sheet and how much undesignated fund balance that we maintain, because we need to kind of maintain that. If it takes a dip in any given year or isn't managed properly, that can have repercussions with the rating agencies that can have effects on the interest that you pay when you go to do large capital projects. So they're all interrelated, and in my expert opinion, if I can call myself an expert, I don't know if I can, but I've been doing this for a long time, and I've dealt with a lot of smart people over the years. I really feel that this is the most responsible way, and there is no less money that can be spent. It's just a question of what we want to spend it on.
Go ahead, Councilor Blunt.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and especially appreciate the challenges of managing those uncertain flows and the need to be proactive about it. So my follow-up question then naturally is about the free cash management, because it looks like the projection is for about 3 million in requests this year. Does that include what's coming, or that seems to be just what's been approved
What page are you looking at?
already? Sorry, on page 4 at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, so that, keep in mind, this free cash, 3.1. Give me a second. That's OPEB, that's stabilization. Just, yep. So that's how much that the council has appropriated so far this fiscal year. We're coming before you next month with a probably $2.5 to $3 million request for additional funds for capital-related investments in infrastructure, and there are some other things that the mayor and I are still working out, so I can't get too specific on that, but there'll be another request. We'll have an opportunity to discuss that in more detail.
I know Mr. Perry wants to, is this a direct follow-up to?
It is, just in terms of, and so maybe it's something Mr. Perry can clarify, because there is no anticipated use of free cash in the revenue stream next year for the reasons that you've described in terms of we don't know yet what it will be, but I'd be curious to know where you expect, now that we're most of the way through the year, where you expect free cash to land at the end of this year.
Yeah, can I do that?
And in the context of
That's all right.
total projected spending for fiscal year '22 is at the level that you're requesting for fiscal year '23.
Let me help my friend Mr. Ailes here a little bit. I think we both agree, we do look at this stuff. We're anticipating, but you never can guarantee, about $8.5 million to be certified next year. Don't hold us to that, but we think, which will be a drop from the 11.2 you saw last November. So we do think it's going to drop somewhat, okay? And some of that is a combination of using the free cash, and the administration, I believe, and we've talked about this a week or so ago in his office, they're going to come before you, 2.5 to 3. We're kind of playing catch with hand grenades on that a little bit. But bottom line to it, we're going to spend some of that down, whatever it is. I'd like to, with your permission, for a couple of minutes, talk about your assessment of I call them local receipts: motor vehicle excise, meals, rooms, fees, fines, Medicaid, all that stuff that's on what they call page 3 of the recap. We are conservative, but I wouldn't agree with the terminology very conservative. That I would disagree with you on, respectfully. We try to be conservative, and we put those financial policies together. Councilor Hausman had a lot to do with that, in a manner to protect these fund balances. Because if we keep eroding these fund balances, it gets smaller and smaller, and we may have a conversation next Monday about the water fund balance a little bit, but as they keep shrinking, it gets us into trouble. I bring your attention a couple communities. I watch this stuff across the Commonwealth. The city of Newton, AAA community. We're not even AAA here. But they kind of went through the approach that some policymakers in this community would like to suggest, where we get a little bit more aggressive on some of these local receipts to try to give relief, as you're contemplating here. And you're not alone. I know there are others who think of that, especially some of the people on the financial forecast. But some of these other communities have done that, and they get into trouble. Newton is laying off school teachers. Town of Saugus, not too far from here. Exact same exercise. They got a little bit less conservative, I guess we can call it, and they get themselves into trouble. And I think I can attest to Mr. Ailes and I, we work really hard to try to push back to make sure we don't get the city into trouble. And so, yeah, we are conservative on some of those receipts. Could we technically do it and get away with it in a year or two? Yeah. But 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you're knocking on the door of layoffs. And that's what we're trying to avoid. The city's in good shape. We're increasing the budget by 4.4%. We're taking care of a lot of our capital projects with our free cash policies, which I think are excellent and maybe one of the finest in the Commonwealth. And I know there's a lot of pushback here, but Mr. Ailes, as he said, he's been doing this a long time. I've been doing it longer than him. And I think he's right, and I think the city's right, and I would caution you as counselors that to continue on that path of being conservative on some of these receipts to protect the fund balances. And I really kind of, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really wanted to address that tonight publicly, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I certainly share the sentiments of Councilor St. Hilaire in appreciating the efforts of the administration previous year to stay below the 2.5% increase of 1.5%, which, as you mentioned, is no easy feat, Mr. Ailes. Building off some of the questions that Councilor Bowen has posed and the response of Mr. Perry and your earlier response, Mr. Ailes, about how the administration was able to, in December of last year, propose the 1.5% increase as opposed to going up to 2.5%, or now in this year potentially over, which, again, I appreciate that is not the proposal here. Essentially, it seems as though motor vehicle excise, for example, is one of the larger non-property tax streams of revenue that could potentially come in above estimates, but we wouldn't know until so far into the fiscal year that it wouldn't impact the tax rate. Based on your earlier answer, it sounds as though really the only revenue stream that could allow us the flexibility to, come December, set a tax rate below the 2.5% proposed now is to see a notable increase in new growth in compared to what is proposed here. Is that correct? Other than the increase in new growth, we really won't have that type of flexibility in December to go below 2.5%?
There are other revenue sources that could come in that, fluctuate from year to year that could cause us to take another look. I'll give you an example. We just took possession of a tax lien over on Concord Terrace. The tax lien on that property was $90,000. It went through the courts. We took the parcel and we just sold it for $400,000. So all that money is not budgeted in the budget. It's unanticipated. But we brought it in. It's additional tax lien revenue. And so that's an example. We could have some building permit revenue for a large project or something that could come in and really drive up those receipts early in the fiscal year. So there are areas that we can look at that will tell us kind of what's ahead. What worries me, and I guess you all pay me to worry, is the unknown, right? And we've never been in this specific situation before. So I need to make sure, part of my job as I view it is to make sure that the city doesn't put itself in a position that it can't handle what's thrown at it. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to reading the Wall Street Journal and different, analysts. And, when the term stagflation gets thrown out there, it scares the heck out of me because that's kind of a trifecta of kind of the perfect storm, if you will, that can have some real bad effects on individual families' financial stability in the community. And we want to be able to react to that should that occur. But we also don't want to be over-reliant for continued services on fluctuating revenue streams that can deteriorate and cause us to have to rely on the tax levy to continue to deliver those services, right? Is that?
So that's very helpful, thank you. And what I am deducing from that response is that aside from something like an unforeseen spike in new growth, change in local receipts, even above, what we would have seen in actuals, above and beyond the conservative estimate really wouldn't give us enough stability to responsibly go below a 2.5% increase if the proposal now is 2.5% come December, aside from a big spike in new growth, which it seems like was the major driver to allow us the flexibility to just go up 1.5% the previous year. That's really the only factor that could change between now and December when we ultimately set the tax rate that would allow us to go any lower than the 2.5% being proposed in this budget.
Yeah, there's a number of factors, and I think it's premature, right, to make a clear determination that, yes, we will go up 2.5%. A lot's going to happen in the next 6 months. The state budget isn't even finalized yet we're relying on certain levels, So I think it's a fair conversation to have publicly, and, I think after we know what our new growth is, that's a big milestone for us. So probably November timeframe is when we'll really start taking a hard look at that and share our thoughts with all of you at that time.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to explain all of this to us. I know I've learned a lot tonight. I'm sure everybody else has as well.
The other piece to kind of some of these discussions around revenues is what the administration proposes here isn't the exact revenue makeup that's going to support the budget next year. It's our presentation that we can support the expenditure levels that you all will approve. So as you're reviewing the revenues, if I were sitting in your seat, I would be saying, is the revenue structure as it's proposed enough to support the level of spending that the administration's looking for? It doesn't necessarily matter what bucket it comes out of. And if the answer is yes, then that should be your comfort around the revenue sources. Certainly this dialogue's helpful, but I think by charter, I actually don't think the council votes on revenue. I know we do, but it's not necessary. Yeah, it's the tax rate, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Just to give perspective.
I think we do at the end of the budget process technically. Whether we have to, I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Are you all set, Councilor?
Yes, and thank you for that point, Mr. Ailes, and that obviously then goes into the decision-making process we all have as a council as we go by department and think about whether to, approve the appropriation as proposed or potentially go below.
Sure.
So thank you.
Councilor Rotundo.
Just to stay with the matter, the $2.9 million, which is what we're looking at for increase with the 2.5%, correct?
Yes.
So stay with where we cannot add to the levy, but we can find ways of cutting the budget to say make up that 1%. So, for instance, to get the number 2.9 to bring it down to 1.9, we'd have to find $1 million worth of savings or whatever that 1% is to get it to that percentage. Throughout that whole budget, we'd have to scrub this whole budget, from top to bottom to find money. If we wanted to take and not do any 2.5%, we would have to find $2.9 million in savings throughout the budget that you're committing in front of us, correct? That is the only way we're going to do it. With that said, what is the savings on a typical, we know right now, even if we go with a 0%, let's hypothetically, we go 0% increase, we find $3 million worth of savings, we cut all these budgets, we, make it a real, whatever. The average taxpayer is probably still gonna go up regardless. We said that 3 to 7%,
Yes.
no matter what. So they're still gonna see it. We can't really say, okay, well, we're gonna even go less and make it $5 million in cuts, and we're gonna give you back money on your tax bill. It's just, I don't think it's ever been heard of. If the 2.5% were not to go up and we went flat at 0%, what would be roughly the average savings to the taxpayer's home's bill? Or no savings at all for that matter, because we're still seeing a 3 to 7% increase, correct?
Right, they would still see an increase.
It would be less. Okay, so it would be less than the 3 to 7. So let's say it's 1.5 to 5%, whatever the case may be. On average, we'll go with a $600,000 home right now, because that's really where we're at. And I know it's numbers I'm throwing out at you quickly. Roughly, what's the savings to the average taxpayer for the year?
So let me give you some simple math numbers here. So if you were to cut $2.5 million, right, so not the 2.9, but 2.5, okay? That would mean a savings of $25 per year per $100,000 in assessed value,
Okay.
okay? So $600,000 house, you'd pay, put me on the spot here, so 20,
No, it's 125,000.
$150 less, but you also got an increase, so it might,
It's a smaller
you only go
increase.
up $10 for the year, or you might go down $10 for the year, you know.
But then it's 2.9, or $2.5 million we have to find in our budget, which could be, say, the school department, for instance, which would be, we know that's.
Effectively, a pretty much
And
a
I'm just
level
using that 'cause
funding
it's the
budget,
biggest
right?
budget, part of the budget. It's easier to say, let's look at different parts. If we're scrubbing the budget, there's not a lot of wiggle room in some of these areas. I'm just trying to put that in perspective and just get it out there so people do see that when we go through the budget, and we are well aware that, going up in the tax levy is not popular, but what the actual savings to the taxpayer in the home ownership with the increase of everything is not as great of a significant savings as if we were to, what we're gonna get out of the total amount of money, the 2.5 million, as opposed to the individual taxpayer, I guess. I'm just trying to put that in perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair, it's an accurate assessment, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to thank Councilor Rotundo. That's a question I usually ask every year to you, is like, what would be the impact on a typical household if you didn't do that? So, thank you. Councilor St. Hilaire.
I just wanted to make the point that Mr. Ailes made earlier, which is that savings would compound over time and live on in sort of perpetuity. It's not just a one-time savings, but because your increased levy didn't go up the next year, you'd save that money again.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, Councilor Bowen.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the conversation, even though some of it is either more detailed or bigger than maybe is necessary. And I really appreciate your description of how to think about the revenue side as just, can we feel certain that we can cover all the expenses that we're digging into on the expenditure side? And I think that is a really helpful way of looking at it. And I'm trying to look at it from that high level. And I think that's where it almost makes me wonder if we're not being ambitious enough on the expenditure side for the world that we're in right now with rising costs and needs in the city, given that we are projected to spend more in fiscal year 22, or raise more in fiscal year 22 than we're expecting to spend or budgeted to spend in fiscal year 23 because of revenues that came in stronger, grants, anything else that led to the difference between that original budget passed last year and the revised budget, or the projection of where we're going to land, which makes me very comfortable about our ability to meet the expenditure side as proposed, and makes me wonder, if we're doing that well, are you anticipating that much of a drop in every other revenue stream next year?
In terms of positive revenues?
Just in terms of revenue projections.
Oh, you mean when compared to this year's actuals?
Yeah.
So there's two parts to that. We call it the page 3. It's the page 3 on the recap, and it's all these local receipts that Mr. Perry was referring to. When we submit a tax rate, we're required to explain what our budget is for FY23 in all these areas. If in any area we're projecting higher than what came in actuals in the previous year, I'll have a tough time setting a tax rate. I mean, we could probably get it there, but I would need to really jump through hoops and explain why, and we'd need to be confident that the landscape has changed enough that we would see an increase. So that's one piece of it. So we always want to be below that. The second piece to it is, Mr. Perry was talking about the city's situation back when the charter was built and the financial situation we were in at that time. Because we were in that situation, we weren't able to invest in the very expensive infrastructure we have throughout the city. This method of budgeting for these local receipts allows us to continue to invest in a responsible way in infrastructure. So it may not be all the services that may, everyone's probably got a different perspective on what's most important to them, but it may not be those services, but it's the facade work, it's the work in infrastructure and the roofs and the buildings and all these things that we've been able to accomplish over the years. But coming out of that fiscal situation back, 30 years ago now, right? We weren't able to invest in any of that. So there was a huge backlog. And what happened was, because we had to begin to invest in that, then Mayor Scanlon had to really constrict a lot of the services that we're trying to preserve and are conscious about, delivering now. And you look at the FTE counts and everything kind of came down. We closed firehouses, we closed schools. We really kind of constricted the fixed portion of the budget to be able to take on debt service, to tackle this backlog of drainage issues throughout the city and building, neglect that we let slide. So budgeting this way ensures that we don't wind up back in that situation, because we're able to put, and it's millions, we're putting millions into our city's fixed assets and infrastructures every year because it's expensive and it's necessary. And so this allows us to do that in a way that doesn't over-obligate us, because we see the cash hit the bank account before we spend it.
If I may, following on Councilor St. Hilaire's illustration of sort of the compounding effect of the savings, the flip side is what you just said, which is if you save that money from the city budget on services and infrastructure, you have a compounding effect of neglect and maintenance, of infrastructure that does not get taken care of, which put Mayor Scanlon back into that situation where he had to really struggle to constrain to make certain cuts. So it's the flip side of that same coin, which is the savings that compounds is also the deterioration that compounds if you don't spend the money on a sort of a level trajectory to keep up with services and infrastructure. So it's a philosophical question in part, as well as a budgetary question.
Yeah, and I just want to reflect on that a little bit more and just, reflect on what we're looking at, which is a $150 million budget. That's a $6.4 million increase over last year, which is 4.43%. We're adding proposed 25 new FTEs to the city budget. We're adding record money into road and sidewalks, which I think is great. Obviously, I think this is a result of being in a strong financial position. And this revenue discussion has come up over the years since I've been on the council, and I've always sort of fallen back on, we built the new middle school, we built the police station. These are projects that have been looming for years. I remember the recession when they closed Memorial Middle School, when they were laying off teachers. That was not a pleasant time. And, I would just say, I think there's plenty of new spending in this budget, and if there are disagreements about where, I think that's where Mr. Ailes and I have had issues in the past, and, I think those are appropriate to talk about different areas of priority. But to me, the idea that somehow, there's more money that needs to be spent that's in our budget, I haven't seen that over the years, and I think he's done a very good job putting us in a strong financial position and to achieve a lot. This is a great budget from a lot of perspectives. The road and sidewalk money that we've all been talking about has been able to be increased. The 25 positions, I think, is a healthy amount to see. I don't think I can recall seeing that number of new FTEs in a budget. So I think we're in a strong position, largely due to the work that Mr. Ailes and the mayor have done over the years. So just want to share that as well.
Yeah, well, and we should be, as a council, always having these questions, asking them every single year, every single budget, pushing back, probing, trying to make sure that we're comfortable that we aren't spending more money than we need to, that we do have the revenues that will support the projected, the proposed budget. So it's an important conversation to have every single year, whether it's from which side of the perspective you're looking at. So this is the revenues, which takes us through page 11, I have a couple of very non-global questions, very micro questions that I'd just like to quickly ask before we leave revenues, if there are no other questions. One is on page 5 for Mr. Ailes, line 49740, transfers from the cemetery perpetual fund for ongoing maintenance. This number of $124,175, that revenue source would then be used probably by public services for, mowing and so forth. It wouldn't show up as a single number likely. It would show up, this amount would be split into various different categories on the public services side. Is that right?
There is a cemetery division within the public services budget, and Mr. Collins will be here at some night. We can dive into that, but there's a line within that budget that is maintenance, and we outsource the landscaping.
Yeah, ProTurf.
And it's $110,000. That's what that cost is.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So that's all it covers.
Okay, and then the other, I'm clearly going to have to invest in some bifocals, I'm afraid. Page 9, 2/3 of the way down, line 43210, fees from building permits. This is just sort of more of a reflection of the conversation we're having. Original budget 2022 was $800,000. It's now recommended budget $1,200,000. So that's the reflection of the anticipated portion of new growth that's coming as projected in this budget, correct?
This is actually separate from new growth, but it translates because what may come in through building permits this year likely will be an assessment adjustment for next year. Okay, and then it'll come in as new growth for next year.
Okay, all right, thank you. I have no further questions on revenue. Counselors, any others?
I just had one other small
Oh,
one.
yes, Counselor Bowen?
Thank you. On page 2, the revenues from cell phone service providers and landfill solar, I was just wondering if the new parking lot solar lease payments show up there in this fiscal year or in the future?
No,
somewhere else?
they're not contained in here because we don't know when they're going to go live. There's a lot of factors that could deter that in some way. We'll capture it as soon as it starts hitting the register.
Mr. Ailes, is there anything else you suggest we or Mr. Perry might go through this evening? I think we've done a credible job of, I think it's good this first evening to have this global conversation, and also when we have a relatively light department review. Counselors? I think it makes sense to do that.
Okay. If there are real specific questions, I didn't bring certain backup materials because that section wasn't on the agenda for tonight, but I'm happy to go through it and wing it, and if there are any questions I can't answer, I may need to follow up, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, why don't we take a swing at that and see if we can be out of here by 9.
Mr. Chair,
Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say, we do still have the city clerks.
Oh, thank you
So I'm
very
just
much.
mindful
Good
of.
point.
So I'm just curious about,
Yeah, no, I
given that Mr.
appreciate
Ailes.
that. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. Maybe we do debt and pensions, especially if Mr. Ailes doesn't have his materials, and do the city clerk. Try to get out of here by 9. I think that's. Thank you, Mr. Ailes.
I just wanted to add on that
President Flowers.
that was my thought process, not, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that, given that Mr. Ailes said he didn't have as many of the specific,
Yeah.
pieces of information, that maybe it would be a.
Yep. Well, I do not want us to go past 9. I mean, I really want to
Number on the side before.
keep to that as much as we can. We started at 6:30, so every evening I'm trying to get out of here at a reasonable hour. Ms. Kent,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hello.
would you like to introduce yourself and your work to the council?
I think you all know me well. I'm here for any questions. I really didn't change much of the budget. I think I've increased 2 lines that I've asked and discussed with probably all of you. I would like to say about my staff, though, that, you know, they do a really good job, as well as what Mr. Ailes was saying, that, you know, we've been shorthanded since January. We finally filled that. And Katie and Will and Christine have done a really good job just holding down the fort shorthanded. And, you know, they're all new. We were talking about replacing knowledge and everything. Will's the longest standing besides myself, and he's only been there 3 years. So for all the stuff that we accomplished, it's a pretty good staff that we have. So I want to thank them.
Yeah. Mr. Barry, do you have anything in particular you'd like to discuss regarding the clerk's office? You work very closely with them on an ongoing basis.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the other thing I'd add, we've had some conversations. I know the city clerk has worked with the finance director to add some additional funding for stipends for elections officials. I know that the clerk has been challenged trying to get good people to take time off during our elections to do that, so she successfully increased her appropriation request, and the mayor and the finance director agreed with it. So that's something that's a little bit new, and I think it's a positive thing, given how extremely difficult it is to get elections officials to work at the polls and things of that nature. So I think that's probably one of the bigger things that the clerk was successful at. But beyond that, from my observations, it's pretty much level funded. And the only other thing I'd add, too, as you know, it's been discussed, it was even discussed earlier this evening before we started. The council is contemplating an ordinance change allowing for how we're going to set the salaries and the evaluations of the city clerk and the assistant city clerk, which certainly I've supported. What's going to happen, though, for FY23, because of, hopefully, you'll pass it, I believe, next Monday night, and I'll be there for that. But if you pass it, it's like a 2, 3, 4 month waiting period for the Attorney General to approve that ordinance. And as a result of that, we are unable to put in an appropriation for FY23 to handle whatever modifications that the city council wishes to do with the clerk and the assistant clerk. So what will happen in FY23 in terms of that, there's a request, I think the mayor will get into it, I think it's $200,000 for non-union positions. This will be the last year we'll do that with the city clerk, where the council president will sit with the mayor and go over what they think the clerk, that we'll do that this year. But starting this year, if you pass it next Monday night, and if the Attorney General approves it, then starting next March, I think it is, the council will evaluate the clerk, and then we'll build in for FY24 the salary, so it'll be a different methodology. So other than that, those are the only 2 things that I can envision in the clerk and the clerk of committees and budgets with regard to Ms. Kent.
Thank you.
That helps.
Thank you. Ms. Kent, is there anything you'd like to add on to that? President Flowers, Councilor St. Hilaire, go ahead.
Yes, Ms. Kent, how are you? Wanted to ask you about early voting and budget associated with that. I saw some line items on page 16 for inspectors and private details. It looked like they'd increased. And just wanted to get just a general feedback on how are we doing with managing early voting and that process.
So right now, we're not sure about the early voting, how many weeks it's going to be for this year. I'm guessing it might be a week in September and 2 weeks in November. And Mr. Ailes and I had discussed it with Mr. Perry as well, and put that in with the budget.
And is that under the inspectors and the private
Wardens
details?
and clerks, yeah.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
private detail is the police.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
President Flowers?
Thank you. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, Ms. Kent, to you and your whole team for all the work that you do supporting the city council for sure, and obviously our elections as well as being, I think, I think all of the departments in City Hall are public facing, but I think it's fair to say the clerk's office is potentially one of the most public facing offices in City Hall, given what people need to come and get from the clerk's office, questions about licensing their dog, getting married, getting their child's birth certificate, finding out about a death certificate. So I just want to thank you. I know you and your team have worked really hard to be really a positive and helpful face of the city and on behalf of the city for our residents. So thank you. I just wanted to make mention of one of the 2 increases that were highlighted, the one about election workers, which is item 51614. and just mention my support for that. I know you had made us aware of that, your desire to make that increase, but people may not be as aware, especially if they're watching, that you had done research looking at surrounding communities as well. And I think in terms of justice and equity and being fair in terms of labor, all things that our city is thinking about on a broad spectrum, making sure that people who are giving their time to this kind of work are being fairly paid and equitable with our neighbors is important. So I'm very supportive of that, and thank you for the research you put in.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you very much, you and your team, you and Christine in particular, for helping put together everything that's going into this budget review process, this scheduling and so forth. Very much appreciated. Councilor Rotundo.
Thank you. Quick question, just in the restoration, the line item for restoration, $2,000. I know you and I have talked about storage, more so than we are talking about restoring. So I wanted to first just bring that to the attention that I know you haven't gone for the CPC grant money because what's the sense of restoring these books if we don't have a proper place of storing them? Have you had any update on identifying the location? Is that middle school location still available? I know that, and I'm also well aware that City Hall is, consideration for rehabbing, which may be the location that's being done, but I mean, we still do have valuable books that are sitting downstairs.
Right. We
So-
did, when I had the budget meeting with the mayor and Mr. Ailes, we did discuss possibly in the middle school. I haven't heard much more of that because they had to check with somebody else, I forget who. But then Mr. Perry knows a little bit more, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, Council, I was involved in that. That's why I stepped up here a little bit. As you know, we're looking forward to renovating City Hall. And obviously, we have some opportunities with the old police station as facility space. So one of the things I know in talking with Mr. Ailes and certainly with the city clerk, we're going to make sure when we get to that point, the scope of services is going to have a direct, robust conversation about record retention and where we're going to store it and how we're going to do it. So I realize that those I've been down that basement. It's bad. There's no question about it. And it's completely unacceptable because I am where we would probably, possibly damaging the records. But I think we need to be a bit patient here. I think there's a bigger picture. My gut instincts is if we can do what we want to do and we all stay with our free cash policies and do all the things with debt and everything else that we've talked about, my instincts tell me the next 2 or 3 years we can address all that, do it properly, climate control. I think the space will be there, and I'm encouraged and optimistic that we're going to achieve that goal.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm good. That's my question. Thank you.
Councilor Bowen?
Thank you, and I'll keep it short because I see we're ticking up towards that 9 o'clock. But I'll add my thanks and appreciation for the increases where I think they really are needed and will help. And only wanted to ask about if you had any implementation plans from the race equity audit on outreach. I know, as President Flowers said, the incredible service that the clerk's office provides once people navigate their way and get in with the staff, and just the areas highlighted around outreach. I know there's an advertising line, as we were talking about with procurement. Are there any plans that are in here or in the works that you can share around the sort of equity and inclusion goals that the city has?
Well, I was on the committee with Councilor Feldman, and we put our input where, we made suggestions that, especially in our office, we don't just serve the residents of Beverly, we serve anybody who has a birth certificate, gets married, or passes away, or whatever. So a translator or something like that would be a great thing. And we did just hire somebody new, but we did go through a lot of different applicants, and the person that we ended up hiring was Linda from the welcome desk, so she was kind of familiar with the process of our office, and she was just the best candidate. So we're doing our best to kind of work that out, but, using suggestions and working with the mayor's office and giving our suggestions of what we need.
Thanks.
Anyone else? I think we're set with your office. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Gank. Counselors, I think that'll be a wrap for tonight. Tomorrow night, we'll have department heads from Planning and Special Services, Library, Council on Aging, Health, and Parks and Recreation. So I don't think we'll be quite as likely to have the kind of some of these global conversations. But it's always going to be my intent that we're never meeting past 9 o'clock to try to keep reasonable hours as best we can. And if we get into under that, so much the better. So, any questions? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn Committee of the Whole. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion to adjourn Finance and Property.
So moved.
Second?
All those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned.
Thank you.